On About Books, we delve into the latest news about the publishing industry with interesting insider interviews with publishing industry experts. We'll also give you updates on current nonfiction authors and books, the latest book reviews, and we'll talk about the current nonfiction books featured on C-SPAN's Book TV. And welcome to About Books on Book TV. Now, in a few minutes, we'll talk about free speech on college campuses. Legal scholar Cass Sunstein has written a book on the topic in response to student protests this past year. But first, here's some of the latest news from the publishing world. Well, the audiobook market continues to show growth in the U.S. A recent report from the Audio Publishers Association found that audiobook revenue grew 9% last year to $2 billion. The fastest growing genres for audiobooks: history, biography, memoir, health and fitness, and religious and faith-based books. A survey from the Audiobook Trade Association showed that 38% of adults listened to an audiobook last year. That's up from 35%. And we also want to note a couple of upcoming books. In October, Little Brown will publish the sequel to Malcolm Gladwell's 2000 bestseller, The Tipping Point. As with the original, Revenge of the Tipping Point seeks to understand a variety of social phenomenon and social epidemics. Topics include why, in the late 1980s and early 90s, Los Angeles became the bank robbery capital of the world, and it also explores what big cats and clusters of teen suicide have in common. Now, in February of next year, one of the world's richest men will release the first of what's expected to be a 3-book memoir. Bill Gates is publishing Source Code with Knopf. Mr. Gates describes the book as a reflection on his early years from childhood through his decision to leave college and start Microsoft with fellow computer pioneer Paul Allen. Quote, "I write about the relationships, lessons, and experiences that laid the foundation for everything in my life that followed," Mr. Gates said. "I'm planning to write 2 more memoirs, one about my work with Microsoft and one about philanthropy, but Source Code is my origin story." And finally, the New York Times reports that Costco will stop selling books year-round. The big box store will focus book sales on the end-of-the-year holiday season. The Times says the decision, in part, is based on the labor costs incurred from displaying books. And now a conversation about free speech on college campuses. Cass Sunstein is a Harvard professor. He's the author of at least 30 books. His most recent is Campus Free Speech, a pocket guide. Professor Sunstein, you have written about free speech in the past. Is this one different?
Completely different. This is focused on campuses and free speech principles applicable to campuses. Obviously, its inspiration is recent events on campuses, and this is a new and distinctive topic.
When did you start this one?
You know, I started during the early protests associated with things involving Palestine and Israel, and I wanted to step back a little bit and think about broad principles and how they might be brought to bear on these particular controversies. But it took me, of course, to campus speech generally, to questions about race and gender, and questions about funding, and questions about the neutrality of the university. And it's been about an 8-month labor of, I can't say love, but of intense focus.
Overall, what is your take on the First Amendment and free speech?
Well, I like them both. And the idea that free speech is central to education and to the university, including receptivity toward protests that people love or despise. Receptivity toward freedom of speech is central to our country, central to liberty under law, central to self-government, central to respect for one another.
In this book, The Campus Guide to or Campus Free Speech, a pocket guide, you write, "Educational institutions are distinctive, even unique. The educational mission will require an assortment of restrictions on speech. You can't run a college or university without imposing such restrictions. Can you go a little deeper and explain that to us?
I sure can. So the headline is "Free Speech!" ! Free speech for all. The story underneath the headline emphasizes that if you're teaching a course, let's say on American history, and someone wants to write a paper on climate change and how terrible it is, the teacher can say, actually, this is a course on American history. Or if a professor in a course on American history wants to teach about, let's say, black holes and physics, the university can say, actually, you're teaching a history course. You're not teaching a course on black holes and physics. So universities, by their nature, have some constraints. They're neutral with respect to point of view, almost always. But some restrictions on free speech are essential. If a student in class decides it's time to whistle or to sing Taylor Swift songs, you can prevent that, not because there's anything held against Taylor Swift songs. Please not. We love Taylor Swift, or even against whistling, but because the educational mission requires a particular kind of focus.
What about when it comes to protests? If, and this is an example from your book, a woman's place is in the home, down with Israel. Should those be allowed on a public or private campus?
Well, I prefer to focus not on the should, but on the what's our system all about. So, what's our constitutional order create and give us? So, if it's a public university, it's bound by the First Amendment. And broadly speaking, if someone says something about gender or about another nation that's disagreeable, that's completely protected and it can't be censored because one doesn't like the viewpoint expressed or even think that it's harmful or dangerous. So a public university bound by the First Amendment has to permit that kind of speech. A private university is not bound by the First Amendment. That's often not understood and comes to as a surprise to people. But if a private university wants to censor speech, the First Amendment doesn't stand in the way, it doesn't apply. But having said that, in my view, it's a really good start for private universities to say we believe in freedom and the free speech principles that apply to our siblings on the public side. We're going to try to stick with those.
Cass Sunstein, what about out and out falsehoods? Are those free speech?
It depends. If you libel somebody who's, let's say, just an ordinary person on campus, you're libeling a fellow student, then that's not protected by the First Amendment, broadly speaking, certainly if it's an intentional falsehood. If you say something like, Tom Brady isn't the greatest football player who ever lived, that's a falsehood. That doesn't violate anything. It's an expression of opinion. In my view, it's an unfortunate expression of opinion as a Tom Brady fan, but falsehoods of multiple kinds are protected. Fraud is not protected. So if you say, please buy my book, if you buy my book, you'll never lose hair, the author's own fate suggests that that would be a fraudulent statement and the government can stop fraud.
You talk about in campus free speech the Brandenburg Test. What is that?
It's a very beautiful thing. It's basically the First Amendment's effort to specify the clear and present danger test. And the idea is if someone is engaging in a speech that's directed to incite, meaning intended to incite, and likely to incite imminent lawless action, that can be stopped. It grows out of the idea of falsely crying fire in a crowded theater, but it's broader than that. So if you're at a building and you say to an assembled crowd, let's go storm the building and take it over and let's say hurt the inhabitants or imprison them or something, that is not protected because as the scenario is described, it's likely to incite and directed to incite imminent lawless action. Note that the test, it has some fancy words in it. It's both a green light for speakers and a red light for speakers, and the green light is bigger than the red light.
What's the Brandenburg reference?
Okay, that's the Brandenburg is not about the gate in Berlin. Brandenburg is a Supreme Court decision that laid down that test in the context of speech by the Ku Klux Klan.
And was that Oliver Wendell Holmes who wrote the decision?
It actually grows out of an opinion by the court that long followed Oliver Wendell Holmes, but the clear and present danger test was something he helped devise.
In the past year, with the student protests that we've seen across the nation, how do you think your university, Harvard, did in maintaining free speech, respect, etc.?
I haven't studied my own university's actually concrete practices. I focus more on the doctrines. So I want to investigate specifically what's happened before speaking to that. At the law school, which is my primary residence at Harvard University, the practices have been very strong. They've been very speech protective and very insistent that any regulation of speech has to be done in a way that's neutral with respect to the content of the speech. And the law school, which is, the place I know best, has been so far as I've been able to observe, admirably protective of multiple points of view, though everyone understands that there are things that you can't do. You can't disrupt a class, you can't seize property, you can't hurt anybody, you can't impose a direct threat on people.
Recently, the Stanford University president's office was overtaken by students, and after that they dismantled some of the encampments in the quad. How do you think Stanford handled that? Is that free speech to take over the president's office?
Well, no. So if you take over an office, that's trespass and probably a little worse than trespass. And the thing to note about trespass law is that it's neutral with respect to the content of the speech. And that's really important. If people on the left want to take over an office and say, this is our office now, when it's actually the president's office, that's regulated. And if people on the right do the same thing, that's regulated and regulable. And the Supreme Court's been very clear that content neutral and viewpoint neutral restrictions, time, place, and manner restrictions, they're not automatically going to be upheld. But if they're protecting, let's say, bodily integrity or protecting property, that kind of regulation is highly likely to be just fine. Stanford isn't governed by the First Amendment. It's a private university, but aspirationally it should at least start with a commitment to free speech principles, and protecting university property is broadly consistent with respecting free speech principles.
Well, Professor Sunstein, we saw at Columbia this past year that some students felt threatened. Is that a limit on free speech?
Well, feeling threatened isn't a justification for restricting freedom of speech. So if you feel threatened, kind of welcome to the human race. People regrettably feel threatened, and that's not a reason to stop speech. There's a kind of term in free speech law called the heckler's veto, where a heckler isn't allowed to veto speech, and feeling threatened is kind of in the general category potentially of a heckler's veto. But if people actually are threatened, the Supreme Court has been clear that a true threat is not protected by the First Amendment. So if someone goes up to someone and says, if I see you, something bad is going to happen to you because I'm really mad, that's a true threat. And if it's credible and sincere and understood that way and intended that way, it can be regulated. But universities should welcome, I think, speech that makes people uncomfortable, even a little bit concerned. Being to feel scared, no one welcomes that. But in a system of free expression, people are sometimes going to feel a little scared.
Well, on the flip side, some speakers at college campuses have been shut down. Is that free speech?
It depends. So if there's someone who's speaking and people are shouting that speaker down and preventing them from speaking, then the shouters can be punished. So there's no constitutional right to shout people down. If there's a speaker who is not invited, I'm not saying disinvited, is not invited, then that's okay. Could have some complexity if a public university is inviting people of one point of view and of another point of view. That's very hard to police, but then we're at least in the domain of the discussable. If someone is invited and then disinvited because of their point of view, and it's a public university at least, then we have some free speech issues to worry over. And there's something fundamental here, which is restricting speech because of the viewpoint of the speaker is kind of a core free speech evil. Restricting speech because of the content of speech, even if not the viewpoint, that's bad too, not quite as bad as viewpoint. Content neutral restrictions are just fine. So if you say, we're not going to have speeches in the month of December, let's say, because it's time for studying, not going to speeches, that's all right.
Cass Sunstein, as an employee essentially of Harvard University, should Harvard have the right to restrict or manage your speech personally? And how would that be different if you were an employee of the University of Massachusetts, say?
Okay, so Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts is governed by the First Amendment. Harvard isn't. So Harvard has more latitude to regulate speech than the University of Massachusetts or the University of Michigan or any state university. For universities to function, I suggest they ought to at least start with the foundation of the First Amendment, even if they're not required by the Constitution to follow it, that we need universities for the sake of students above all, but also all of us. We need universities to be places of freedom rather than places of censorship. If Harvard says to me, I teach a course called administrative law, that in your administrative law, you can't really talk about your free speech book because you're teaching administrative law, not your free speech book, that's completely fine. If Harvard says you can't in your administrative law course focus the course 100% on climate change, that's okay too, because administrative law and climate change, while they overlap a bit, they're not the same thing. So that kind of restriction is fine. If the University of Massachusetts said to a professor, you have to toe a political line in your courses. Now we're talking about a free speech problem. And if Harvard did that, there wouldn't be a technical First Amendment problem, but there would be a serious free speech problem in the colloquial sense. So we want diversity of views in people on the right, people on the left, people on the center, people in domains that you can't really characterize. We want to authorize that on the university campus. It's in the interest of students and it's in the interest of the nation to have diverse views.
Who is a pocket guide, Campus Free Speech, written for?
Well, it was written in the first instance for the author to try to figure it out, but I hope it's of general interest to anyone focused on kind of the enduring and inspiring ideals of our country. And a lot of those ideals, if they're to live, have to live in families, in churches, in synagogues, and they have to live on campuses.
Now, if somebody picked up your 2005 book, Why Societies Need Dissent, would they find consistency with the campus guide?
I don't think they'd find inconsistency, and they'd find the same general focus on the centrality of freedom for, let's say, a well-functioning political order. But my little book on dissent is very focused on the risks of conformity and how that can be stultifying. The free speech on campus book is focused much more on the campus setting and some of the controversies in the last years, and I predict in the coming years.
Campus Free Speech, a pocket guide, Appendix A. You have a proposed framework. What is that?
It's little. It's about a page. It might be less than a page. The basic idea is a central commitment to freedom of expression and diversity of view and plurality of view, a commitment to not regulating speech on the basis of viewpoint ever, a commitment to safety for speech, not safety for feelings. At the same time, an insistence that people's property is going to be respected, that the classroom integrity is going to be respected. So if people start using, let's say, a really bad word over and over again in a class, that's not welcome and that can be stopped. That's not consistent with the educational enterprise. A commitment to freedom from sexual harassment, for example, that's consistent with freedom of speech. There's nothing in the First Amendment that protects a professor from saying, sleep with me or get a bad grade. That's not protected by the First Amendment. And there's a commitment to allowing time, place, and manner restrictions, but not allowing viewpoint-based restrictions.
Cass Sunstein, we've been talking about free speech on the individual level, but what about as an institution? Should Harvard, should the University of Massachusetts have free speech as an institution as represented by their leadership?
They should. So if the head of, let's say, Stanford or the head of the University of California at Berkeley wants to say something, the First Amendment, broadly speaking, protects that. But at the same time, in my view, it's unwise for university administrators and universities to take positions on public issues. It's much better for them to have a position of neutrality, that the gain socially of, let's say, Columbia University saying we're against X or we're for Y is modest, and the loss from that is serious, that the university's ability to foster diverse views internally is reduced if the university has publicly committed it to a certain point of view. And the proper place for university members to state their views is in their individual capacity, not in their capacity as representatives of the institution. Now, if a university president wants to say, my view is the following, that's mostly protected by the First Amendment, certainly against the government. But if a university wants to say, because you're in an administrative capacity, we really need you to keep quiet on a few things, that's the Supreme Court has made clear something like that is potentially okay. Just like the Secretary of State can be told, if you want to be Secretary of State, you have to be broadly speaking in a way that's consistent with the president's views. So someone who's running a university can be told, you got a job here, and certain kinds of political statements might make it harder for you to do your job. We have to be very careful there, but that's the broad direction of the analysis.
Well, in the past year, we saw that both the president of Harvard and the president of the University of Pennsylvania lost their jobs when it came to protest free speech and their congressional testimony. What was your take on that?
Well, even though I teach at Harvard, I haven't focused on the specifics of particular cases involving Penn or Harvard. I focus more on the principles, the free speech principles that apply. In the first instance, it's important to say that Harvard's a private university, and just to reiterate that it's not governed by the First Amendment. Broadly speaking, and abstracting from any particular controversy, presidents and administrators, department chairs, offices, people who run the admissions office, because of their particular roles, they don't have the same kind of latitude that people without those roles would have. There's an old Supreme Court case called Pickering, which basically says that government employees do have freedom of speech, no question about that. But there are things that in your capacity as government employee, you could do or say that would be inconsistent with performing your job well. And that could be true for, let's say, a dean of admissions also. If a dean of admissions says something that makes it hard to be a dean of admissions because students think the dean of admissions thinks this, then the university would have some latitude that they wouldn't have if the dean of admissions were merely, let's say, a professor of English literature.
At the beginning of this interview, I said that you were the author of about 30 books. What's the official count?
I'm not counting the number of books I have. I'm more kind of trying to make the next one as good as it can be.
You're also the co-founder of an initiative on artificial intelligence and the law. When it comes to AI and books, how does that fit in?
Well, there's a close connection. So AI is, of course, creating a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of concern. And one issue is what regulation of AI is consistent with the First Amendment. And this is a fascinating new issue. It applies to the university, by the way, as well as to all of us. So here's something that's clear. If a professor writes a paper using AI, and the university says you kind of can't do that because you're going to be evaluated on your work, not on ChatGPT's work. That's not inconsistent with the First Amendment. Or if a student hands in a paper using AI and the student is reprimanded or punished on the ground that it has to be their own authorship, that's consistent with the First Amendment too, assuming that the university is a public university. There's no right to plagiarize, so too there's no right to use artificial intelligence. There are cases in which imaginable restrictions on uses of AI would raise a serious First Amendment question, and this is extremely interesting, and these are novel issues. One reason is that even if AI itself doesn't have First Amendment rights, a typewriter doesn't have First Amendment rights, a vacuum cleaner doesn't have First Amendment rights, AI as such wouldn't have First Amendment rights, but listeners and readers have First Amendment rights. So there could be hard free speech issues. If it were said, for example, that AI can't be used to speak critically of public officials, that would violate the rights, in all probability, of readers and listeners. It would be viewpoint-based discrimination, and it would prevent those who use AI from seeing things that had at least a variety of points of view on that issue.
Cass Sunstein, what about book bans? Should college libraries be allowed to take books off shelves?
The simplest answer is no, but the more interesting answer is the Supreme Court has said that certain restrictions on removal of books from libraries can raise a serious First Amendment question if it's viewpoint based. So if you say, I'm going to take away things from the library that say certain things on abortion, that's a serious First Amendment problem. It's a form of viewpoint discrimination. If the university says, we have too many sports books in our library and we don't have enough space, so we're going to take away books that involve the sport of squash. I say this against interest. Squash is a racket sport, which I love dearly and I play. And to take away the books that involve squash would be, in my parochial view, lamentable, but it wouldn't violate the First Amendment. So we need to know exactly what the line is that the universities are drawing. Book bans that are viewpoint-based are extremely troublesome. I think we have to draw a distinction between removing books, which is really deeply questionable, and not buying books in the first instance. That's harder to police, but we have at least a serious First Amendment problem so long as viewpoint is what's on the surface or in the background.
Cass Sunstein, his most recent book is called Campus Free Speech, a Pocket Guide. We appreciate your being on Book TV.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
And you're watching About Books, a program and podcast produced by Book TV. Well, on Tuesdays, new books are published. Here's a few. George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley is out with a new book on the First Amendment and the political and legal attacks it has faced through history. The book is titled The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. Also just published, journalist D.W. Gibson is out with an oral history of the 1999 World Trade Organization protests in Seattle. It's titled 1 Week to Change the World. And one more book that's just out, In 15 Cents on the Dollar, journalists Louise Story and Ebony Reed explore the causes of disparities in wealth between black and white Americans. Well, thanks for joining us for About Books, a program and podcast produced by C-SPAN's Book TV. Book TV will continue to bring you publishing news and author programs. And a reminder that you can get this podcast on the C-SPAN Now app. You can also watch online anytime all of Book TV's programs at booktv.org.